Hello, Facebook. It's Thursday. You know what that means. Rock and Roll 101 live on the Loudhouse Podcast Network. It's your old pal McGee, and with me, as usual, the leggy and busty Mr. Dino Alexander. How you doing,
We're all
Dino?
pals here. We're all pals. We pal around.
Beth is on hiatus for the day. We have
She's hanging out with her pal, Rialto Ross, I'm sure.
Well, that's nowhere near as funny as what I was going to say, but screw it. No, you killed it. You killed it.
No, do your thing. Do your thing.
Nah, I was just going to say
over.
she was in an undisclosed location, hunting something. I don't know. I was trying to play it. Yeah, hunting pals. Pal. Pal.
Hey,
Sorry,
pal.
that's a McMahonism. You hear enough stories about how Vince McMahon calls everybody pal. That's right. Good shit, pal. And so, me, I love doing wrestler speak and talking the jargon, the lingo.
We talked. Speaking of pals, Trevor's on the first one on the comments here.
Of course he is.
Eddie's 5:30. He's giving us shit because we're 20 minutes late. That's the thing about the internet, man. We do it on our time.
There is no time, baby.
Right.
It's
a construct. Listen, all you iHeart
time is an illusion, man.
I'm not a slave to the iHeart clock, Trevor. We're freeform. We're freeform out here, baby.
Corporate.
Wow.
No, it's just kind of funny because I've been knee deep in my Jimi Hendrix catalog as of recently, and it's expanded my mind, man.
Oh wow.
It's all trippy and shit. No, that being said, I'm like heartbroken that on the subject that we have today that I can't even talk about anything Jimi Hendrix because he was already dead by this point. It's just re-listening to some stuff, especially like live performances by Hendrix, mind blowing. Unbelievable. It
would be interesting to see, like, if he survived and was still alive at this point. I don't know if he even would be, but if he had was at a ripe old age, like if he was touring, like, or he could do tours with the sound advancements and the digital and the everything that they can do now, and the show and the lighting and the video and it would just be probably people would be losing their minds, I think, too.
I mean, honestly, there's a part of me that thinks that 80-year-old Jimi Hendrix would be the old blues man.
Right.
Like he would have turned into like Howlin' Wolf or Buddy Guy or any of his predecessors. Yeah. Like he'd just be the old black man wearing a fedora hat, playing his guitar. Right. And just, because like, it's funny, just not to go on too much of a tear because it's.
Wait, he wouldn't be the old white guy playing a guitar.
No, I just don't think that he would have been quite as experimental.
Right.
As he was in his 20s, because if you listen to the progression, once, Buddy Miles and Billy Cox joined the band, once Noel Redding was gone and Mitch Mitchell had left, it was a completely different band. It was a lot more. I mean, the original Band of Gypsies, Mitch Mitchell was still in. That album in the 70s was the last album that Mitch Mitchell worked on with them.
Right.
But the first rays of the New Rising Sun was a collection of the stuff that was supposed to be the next album, the next part of the evolution of Jimi Hendrix, and it was a lot more blues based. Right. And I mean, like I was talking about it with Terry, and I said, you can hear the difference in Hendrix between Axis and Electric Ladyland, because I think Noel Redding was gone for Electric Ladyland. I think Buddy Miles was the bass player at that time. I think he's the one that was on there. But you can just hear the difference in Hendrix without Noel Redding. Like Noel Redding was a bigger part of the the sound of
the dynamic
Jimmy. Yeah, because like, and I mean, it goes back to like, I remember reading about Noel Redding thinking that he should have been the front man for the Experience.
Right.
Like how big does your ego have to be to think that you're in a band with Jimi Hendrix and
Right.
you should be the front person? Like it doesn't make sense to me, you know.
Well, I mean, yeah, well, I mean, that was, well, you kind of think if you're like, you know, it translated to somewhat, you know, down the line, you know, like a David Lee Roth is always trying to outshine an Eddie Van Halen. Steven Tyler always trying to outshine Joe Perry. You know, you have to have that kind of mentality because you're the singer. Now, maybe you play guitar on a couple of songs, but you know, you want the attention, you know, you're the focus. And for the lay listener, maybe even, you know, the singer is the focus. The musicians are just kind of around, you know, they're around, but right. You know, unless you're really into a band or whatever, you know, you focus on the presentation, and the presentation comes from the singer for the most part.
Well, so. or the lead guitarist, which it happens to be that Jimmy was both. So
right.
Like, and I mean, when you look at the dynamic of that trio, Noel Redding is the weakest link in that whole band, because Mitch Mitchell is an amazing drummer,
right? And
he's paired with a guitarist who was one of the most phenomenal experimental guitarists in the history of music,
right?
You know, like there's not a single guitarist on this planet that doesn't have. You know, like I always make the joke, Jimmy's never on anybody's list because it's kind of stupid when everybody has Jimi Hendrix as number one. Right. Like there's no denying that Jimi Hendrix was a god amongst insects when it comes to performing with a 6-string guitar. That man did more with 6 strings than anybody before him or since, you know.
64 Fender Stratocaster strung upside down for a left-handed motherfucking genius.
Jimi Hendrix. Oh yeah. Now I want to watch Fort Fairlane. So you know, just let's give a little bit of backstory for those that are watching today. I know that the podcast has been in a weird state of flux over the last, you know, month or two with the fact that you've been busting your ass regularly. You actually somehow dragged me into it with you. So
yeah, I figure you like to bust some ass every once in a while.
I do. I like to smack ass more than I like to bust ass, but you know, what are you gonna do? So I just want people
it's to know sometimes these days.
I take what I can get when I can get it, baby. But it just letting people know that we haven't given up. We're still doing it. It's just a matter of schedules are a little funky right now. So hopefully over the next couple of weeks, we'll be getting back into the regular swing.
And then we'll screw it all up again in January.
Of course we will. Could you expect anything less?
No. Who are you expecting at the door?
Nobody. The wind cried Mary and the door just flew open. So
Jimmy heard us, man. Jimmy heard us.
Jimmy, baby. Is Jimmy.
So Jimmy's dead by 71, and that's why we're here for Rock and Roll 101 today. So
absolutely. We are doing albums that are hitting their 50th anniversaries. And, you know, what an amazing year. Like, it was funny when we were talking about the anniversaries, we did 81 and we did 91.
Right.
And 71 was just kind of held in the back as like the card that was going to get played last, but we hadn't gotten to it. And this lineup of albums is unbelievable. It's amazing how each decade, that first year of each decade was just a mind-blowing set of albums that came out, you know.
Yeah, they got the rust off, or the transitional year, you know, with the 0 year, you know, and then you know, once they started going with the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, then things were off. I guess there's that you know, because technically the 0 year belongs to the last decade, if you really think about it. It really does. Yeah, it really does.
It's 10. But it's one of those things where, like, you know, you saw within just the previous 3 years, you get the debut of Black Sabbath, you get the debut of Led Zeppelin, you get the Beatles really changing who they are. By this point, the Beatles are done.
Right.
Let It Be came out in 1970. So anything coming out after Let It Be is all compilations or miscellaneous bullshit. So the Beatles are done. But you have Led Zeppelin, you have Black Sabbath, Jimi Hendrix has left the building by this point. But you still have the Doors and Janis Joplin and a lot of really good up and coming bands that are starting to find their sound and find their niche
audience
in rock and roll.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
and it was so much a different time too, because the audience, it took a long time for the audience to catch up. There was mass media, but there wasn't, it's not to the extent that it is now. When an artist or even an up and coming artist that's got a big label push behind them, everybody fucking knows, this is the new thing, or this is the latest from these guys or whatever. And everybody knows. So now, the way that the more organic way, there was the FM radio of the world and blah, 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 playing album sides and deep cuts and all that bullshit. So, you weren't getting that on the AM top 40. It was all on the FM side and college radio. And they were really pushing, the Yeses, the progression, the progressive bands and, stuff that was a little more experimental and not as quote, mainstream. And it took a while for that to kind of filter to, the audiences on both sides of the Atlantic.
Right. And it's kind of funny because like one of the things I noticed, I did a full headlong dive into the Beatles, and redid my Beatles catalog, and then went and watched the 3-part 7 or 8 hour documentary Get Back on Disney Plus, which I recommend to everybody. Watch it. It's amazing to see some of the crazy shit that goes on just in how Paul and John wrote their music and their lyrics and just the creative process, plus all the drama that was going on behind the scenes. And ironically with George Harrison of all
he wanted to quit the band or something like
he
that.
He did. He walked out after lunch during one session. Like they worked one day and he just walked away. And they kind of went through the rest of the day as a 3-piece, just kind of working out some songs. But like the drama behind it is really kind of interesting. But for me, it was watching John Lennon process song lyrics. And one of the ones in particular was Dig a Pony, and listening to all the different lyrics that it was almost like using nonsense words to fill in the blanks for the melody. But it was just like, it sounded like he was writing out Mad Libs with music behind it. And it's hysterical until you hear all of a sudden he finds, the click. Like the same thing with Get Back. Like there's a really good part where Get Back starts off as a protest song, because there was a big anti-immigration thing going on in England at the time. And so it was kind of funny how it goes from talking about this person who's a Pakistani coming into England, going to becoming JoJo from Tucson, Arizona. It's a weird progression, but it was completely, you see it and it works. But by this point, the heavy hitters are few and far between, and a lot of the up and coming acts are what are really taking note in 1971.
Well, at this point, the old guard is, we've had, a decade or so of rock and roll, maybe a decade plus of rock and roll, So your old guard, your Sinatras, I mean, they're still around, but they are definitely
in a very small box over here.
Right. Exactly. That was definitely not that it wasn't mainstream, but there was definitely like a cultural or an age line of like, okay, if you're under this age, this is what you're listening to. Other than that, then go listen to Perry Como, go listen to Dean Martin. That's Tonight Show stuff. But this time, like I said, you're getting the Doors, you're getting all the the stuff that was a little too hot for the Ed Sullivan Show. your Stones, they're hitting their stride at this point, all that stuff.
Well, and if we jump right in, let's start with the old guard, and we'll go right from the beginning with the Who. By this point, the Who have been around for a considerable amount of time, and they are no longer doing the. I mean, for me, the Who, the early Who, is almost punk rock.
Right.
When you listen to it, they're 2.5, 3-minute songs. They are very guitar driven. And of course, with the maniac Keith Moon on the kit, very drum and rhythm driven. But Who's Next comes out in 1971, which is probably, I would say, their biggest album. Right. I would say that this
bigger
is
than
probably,
Tommy?
Yes, because it was more, just in the sense that it was more radio friendly and mainstream. Right. This is the song this is the album that had big hits on it.
Right. But yeah, but like, I guess, my counter to that would be like Tommy, it was a whole thing. There was a movie, there was, it was a multimedia, it was one of the first, multi-platform kind of hits, and especially for a rock band, they were definitely on the forefront of that. This kind of paves the way, later on for like a Green Day to do their thing.
I mean, the Beatles had already done that.
Right.
In terms of, the Beatles did full on, comedies in Help and Hard Day's Night, where Tommy was still way more music based than story based. The story only took place in the songs, but when I think of Tommy, there's not a lot of quote unquote hits, radio hits. Sure. Where, with Who's Next, you've got Baba O'Reilly, Bargain, Behind the Blue Eyes, Going Mobile, and Won't Get Fooled Again.
Right.
5 big radio tracks, which I'm sure that not all of them were radio tracks when it came out, but they're all in heavy rotation still to this day, 50 years later.
Right. I think, obviously we're talking about like the FM, college radio, all that kind of stuff. That's where those songs kind of found their audiences, and they almost became cult followings, but they played, I don't know, so much because they were the opposite of like a top 40 where there was a serious rotation and a certain rotation on different songs, but they were exposed to a lot more people than would have been, because there was no like quote unquote active rock or just any type of rock 40 or anything like that. It was either pop or it wasn't.
Right. And I mean, and by this point they started writing what was known in the business as like bathroom tracks, because you get a song like Won't Get Fooled Again that's 8.5 minutes. So it gives you enough time to put the record on, you go take a leak, grab a cup of coffee, and make it back to the studio. Like it's one of those things that like I never really thought about it until I was watching like a documentary on, I think it was on Rush, and it was a Detroit radio jock, and she was talking about how great it was that this band was making these long like 10-minute songs that you could go to the bathroom and get a cup of coffee or eat a sandwich or whatever without having to worry about the next track.
Sure.
Whereas the average song was about 3 minutes. And so you had to have the next one queued up by the time that was finished. Sure. So it's just kind of neat. And I mean, I couldn't imagine having to do that with albums. Like it was a big enough pain in the ass doing it with CDs.
Like and all that stuff.
Yes, it's like when I first started in radio, we still had CD players in the studio just in case, whereas my last radio gig did not have a CD player in the studio, which I found amazing.
Right. Well, yeah, I kind of went through all the progressions a little bit because I got at the end of carts. So I worked at a top 40 station initially, and everything was on cart. So there was you never played the wrong version, blah, blah, blah. And, you never a slip cue or issue or anything like that. So it was always ready to go. So it was just the matter of pressing a button. It was basically, the carts are like 8-tracks. For people that don't know, they're just they run on the same concept. They just roll around, and there was different lengths of them. So like if you had a 4-minute song, had to go on a 5-minute card, or whatever. So so those were the days. So we started with that, and then we moved to the CDs, and we actually, the station I was at, we made that progression, and they actually went all in, which was kind of cool. They got the dead-end CD players with the specific boxes. So we used to have this wall where the CDs would go, and these CDs were in like a special box, and then we would use a dynamarker. And so it'd be like, whatever the number of the song was, because that's how it was coded in the computer, when they scheduled the music or whatever. Oh, this is CD number 101 or 120. And it said the name of the artist on it. And then it would have the track number you were supposed to play. Because sometimes even on the singles that you would get, there were different.
There would be multiple songs.
There was the album version, whatever, maybe a B-side or whatever. So, so we would have to do that back in the day. So, and then eventually we, at the same station a few years later, maybe less than 10 years, they went to the computer, and I remember dragging and dropping was such a concept, we have to drag and drop this in here, and weird. And then doing the music too was crazy as well, because then you would have to the music, schedule the music ahead of time, because that's how radio stations are. Just FYI, I didn't mean to burst anybody's bubble, but they scheduled the music ahead of time, and then it would, you would take that little disc. Remember, you used to have a little disc in one computer and save it, and then you take it to the computer that had the automation, and it would transfer that, and they would line up all the songs and all the other commercials and all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's quite a progression of technology that's happening, and this is like, we're still in the album phase at this point. 71. We're not even into 8-tracks, really. I don't think.
No. Yeah. I mean, it may have been the beginning of it, but for the most part, you still only had records, full length LP records,
or 45s, maybe
as
78
as your choices.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, and I mean, this album for the Who is, it's probably got the most songs that I like on it.
Right.
I've never been a guy that liked an entire Who album. I love the Who. I have always loved their energy and their dynamic, but
coherency.
I would be a greatest hits guy with the Who. It's very rare that the deep cuts are the ones that I like with this particular band. There are a few, but it's rare for me. For me, with the Who, it's mostly the hits that I really liked, because they were one of the more avant-garde, silly bands when they were, especially in the early years, like Heinz Baked Beans and shit like that. Boris the Spider. I love Boris the Spider. It's a great song, but it's weird.
And you're not always in the mood for it. Yeah.
Exactly. Or the Ox.
And they got a little self-indulgent too. I mean, obviously something like Tommy is very self-indulgent,
Even worse was Quadrophenia.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it was like that.
Yeah, I mean, and then sometimes in the moment, those albums, like, oh, man, I love that album. I love all the deep shit. And then, a decade goes by and you're like, what wasn't great? That whole fucking thing. Maybe just a couple of the songs were pretty good, but yeah.
It's one of those things where, our musical tastes do evolve as we grow. And just because we liked something 25 years ago doesn't mean that we won't like it, but we will learn to appreciate other things that we may not have previously. Like I never really dug Electric Ladyland, just because we spoke about it earlier. For me, the first two Hendrix albums, Experienced and Bold as Love, were the two that I loved.
Right.
But just the other night, listening to the entirety in running order of Electric Ladyland, I could hear the happiness in Jimi Hendrix, because you could tell that it was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulder, and he was doing exactly what he wanted, how he wanted. And so I've learned to appreciate it now that I'm older than I would have at age 16 or 17.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of, appreciation that comes along with maturity, I think. So
Yeah.
where you go back and you listen and maybe, you go, that album was not necessarily a commercial hit, but I see what they were doing, or this led to this was the album in between these two albums. And this was the progression, or this is when they went, fuck it, we can't do this anymore. We need to go a completely different direction,
Right.
So.
Well, and it's kind of like that's a big thing that they kind of discussed in the Beatles documentary, was that by the time they got done with like Rubber Soul, that's when they stopped touring. They were no longer going out on tours. They kind of separated as humans and started to evolve on their own because they weren't together all the time.
Right.
John was doing his thing, Paul was doing his thing, and when they wrote, they were basically one of them going into the studio at a time or recording at their home studio and then sending it back to the next guy and he's doing his thing. They didn't work in the studio together very often at that point. So this was the first time. And so you get those kinds of dynamics. And,
but at that point, they had been so successful that, they could afford studio time by themselves. They didn't all have to be there, blah, blah, blah. And then they also had their own thing. Paul McCartney's a star. John Lennon is a star on his own. Even George.
And they were dealing with a lot of dramatic stuff going on, like the fact that they couldn't walk around in public without being mauled. The fact that they were getting death threats. The fact that there were countries that that said if they came back, they would be arrested for things that they had said in the press or whatever the case may be. So it got to a point where they were just like, fuck all this. We're just going to go in the studio and record an album and put it out and then take a break and then do another one in next year. And that's exactly what they did. And they started doing that's why they started doing like the Yellow Submarine cartoon movie or the Magical Mystery Tour movie or the Sgt. Pepper movie with the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton. They did all these things to still have their creative outlets and give the public something to latch onto. But at the same time, they didn't have to stand on a stage or worry about crazy shit. And I mean, you look at it, Lennon ended up being assassinated. So being out in public was not always a good thing for them.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know who could say if that had anything to do if they had toured more, but who knows, that's some of the stuff that got addressed in the documentary. Right. But moving on to the next album, we're not going to spend a lot of time on because we've done an entire show on the Rolling Stones when Charlie Watts passed away about 2 months ago. So, but the next album for them was Sticky Fingers, which, I mean, everybody who likes the Rolling Stones, Sticky Fingers is like a requisite of what you have in the collection. It's a classic album. And they've gone beyond they've gone beyond their Beatles phase where they were just kind of this, punky upstart little guys from England with the American rhythm and blues influence, and they're starting to come into their own now. They're writing bigger and better songs. They're writing Wild Horses. They're writing Dead Flowers. They're writing Bitch. That was a cool thing. The Stones had a little bit more edge, obviously, than the Beatles. They were very image conscious, but the Rolling Stones image was obviously a little more bad boy. They were the Donnie Wahlberg.
Well, I mean, they definitely. I mean,
they were the AJ McLean.
My mom always used to make the joke of there were two kinds of girls when she was growing up. There were Beatles girls and there were Rolling Stones girls, and definitely the Rolling Stones girls were a lot more fun.
Right. Yeah, but you might end up doing heroin at the end of the night, though. That's the problem. With the Beatles girl, you're maybe gonna smoke some weed, maybe drop a little acid, whatever. But yeah, it was gonna get pretty dark with the Stones if you hung around too long at the end of the party.
Yeah, you're probably gonna need a shot of penicillin the next day or something like that. So if you want to hear more about our opinions on Sticky Fingers, go check out the Rolling Stones episode. It's really it was a fun episode that we did with Beth. But I'm going to keep moving to one of my favorite artists. And this is somebody that was still moving up the charts. He was still evolving, and that was David Bowie.
Right.
And Hunky Dory is a really cool album. Now, we all know that David Bowie was pretty much off the rails from the beginning anyway. When you look at Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars and stuff like that. But this is the one that this got some really great cuts on it, like "Oh You Pretty Things," one of my favorites, which is "Life on Mars."
Right.
Changes.
Right.
You know,
so I mean, Bowie was always the wild card because he changed all the time. So you could never really say, oh, this is, he was Ziggy Stardust. So then now he's kind of androgynous. Now he's kind of this, he's kind of that. Now he's, all classy and, clean cut. What is the David Bowie thing? It was always very arty with him too. He always seemed like he was operating on a different plane than like the Stones or the Beatles or whatever. He was operating in this kind of, I don't know, nouveau Andy, like there's a song Andy Warhol. He's operating in that upper echelon, that 1%.
Right. He was
neighborhood.
definitely bigger on the art scene when it came to
Fashion.
He was, you got to remember, he worked with Iggy Pop, he worked with Lou Reed, he worked with a lot of really artsy alternative rock and roll before alternative was really a thing. Right. And it kind of
underground, I guess would have been called that. Yeah.
Right. And I'm gonna kind of segue into a band that was very much on par with them. I won't give it away yet. We'll work into it. But like David Bowie, one of the things I always loved about David Bowie was there are very few artists that have evolved on the level that David Bowie did over the span of a 50-year career, because he did start off as a pop star in the mid 60s. Right. He did go into that androgynous, spaceman thing with Ziggy Stardust, and then went into the glam rock part of his career in the mid 70s, which is where he starts getting into right around here, but it really evolves over the next couple of albums. And then by the time the 80s come in and the new wave thing starts hitting, David Bowie is right there with the tailored suits and the coiffed hair. And, that's where you start getting into fashion and fame and that 80s era stuff that he did with Stevie Ray Vaughan for Let's Dance and Glass Spiders, stuff like that. It's unbelievable.
So the thing with Bowie though, is that, no matter what the phase was, he always had something in that phase. Now you may not love all of it, or it may not stand the test of time. And I say that in the bigger sense, but if you went to, if you went to a David Bowie concert, especially later on, you weren't going to hear all of one thing. You were going to get this, the entire catalog, and there was always something from each era that still resonated, was still good, that still was what got the audiences back and what they latched onto. Because I think even like the way that I think people consume music now, more of a best of track by track, whatever. I think Bowie was probably a real big candidate for that, because you didn't necessarily have to sit through an hour of Ziggy and the Spiders from Mars. You just got the Space Oddity and you got the other one, and that was it. And then you were there for Changes, and then you were there for Life on Mars, and all that stuff.
And if you look at some of the stuff he did in the 90s, where he really went into that. Well, no, I was even going into like the industrial stuff.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Where he started collaborating with Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails. Right. When you listen to if you listen to the live shows, he's still doing stuff from the 70s, but it had been changed into
rearranged,
something different. It was rearranged so that it fit with the stuff that he was doing from the Outside album and stuff like that.
Right.
But where I was gonna segue into was this same year, you end up getting T-Rex doing Electric Warrior. And T-Rex it took what David Bowie did for glam rock and put it up one more level. For those that may not be big fans or even know about T-Rex, Bang a Gong was one of their big hits. And on this album, that was the biggest hit. But they were definitely very important. Like even Guns N' Roses covered T-Rex. They did Be With McCain, which is off a different album. But
all those 80s bands always referenced that. I mean, even like Motley Crue, that was like their go-to. Def Leppard, they all love T-Rex. That was a touchstone for them. And even like New York Dolls and all that stuff. Yeah, that's where all that came.
And like the New York Dolls were pretty much right at the same time. They were right behind. They were basically the American version of T-Rex. And it's kind of funny because like, you hear Bang a Gong, and the first band that I would associate it with, because of who I heard the song from first, was Power Station.
Right. That's your age too, though.
With Robert Palmer and John and Andy Taylor from Duran Duran. That was what was
the drummer's name? He was so fucking awesome.
Tony Thompson. He had been previously part of Chic with Nile Rodgers. Funky Town. So he was an amazing drummer. Amazing drummer.
Because there's that song, and the two singles from Power Station that still like an 80s station would play that, and Some Like It, and Some Like It Hot.
Some Like It Hot.
But I mean, just rhythmically, those songs are just next level, even just for
amazing.
pop song. So, but we digress. We're talking about 1971.
And speaking of 71 and bands evolving, another one was a very established band. This was their sixth and final album. And funny enough, it was the first album I ever bought from them, was LA Woman by The Doors.
Right.
And this album was pretty much completely different from everything that they had done before. They had touched on a lot of the blues stuff, but not on the level that this album hit. I don't know if you want to bring it up real quick.
Oh yeah, I'll put it up there. Let me grab it real quick.
This album was by far one of my all-time favorites. It's the first one that I ever bought, and it's just killer after killer after killer.
Yeah, I mean, what a way to go out too, and when you think about how it all ended for Jim, but I mean, Love Her Madly, a great radio song, LA Woman too, but then you get into like The Wasp and Riders of the Storm. I mean, those were like FM radio, late night, talk about taking a shit songs. I mean, right from Riders of the Storm, 7 minutes later, you could smoke a doob and come on back. It was, they were just, they'd really, I think they had maximized everything that they could do as a band at this point. I think if they had done anything after this, it probably would have been more where it was hit and miss. You may get one or two songs here and there, but I think this is probably one of their more, I don't know if it's their most cohesive, but it definitely illustrated where they were at that time, especially where Jim was at that time, and how the band dynamic, they kind of got pushed. And if you watch the Oliver Stone movie too, kind of touches on some of this as well.
Well, for me, this is by far my favorite overall Doors album. There are songs by the Doors. I love the Doors. I've always loved the Doors since I was about 11 or 12 years old. But when this is one of my first Columbia House purchases, and
that were never paid for.
Exactly. And when I go back, there's not a single song on this album that I skip. If I were to put this album on, I would still listen to this album in running order from The Changeling all the way through. And like The Wasp, Crawling King Snake, Car Sits by My Window and Been Down So Long are probably my favorites. Like the real heavy bluesy stuff is the stuff that I really loved on this album. And so like going back to it, it's like a warm blanket for me. It truly is. It's one of the better Doors albums, like you said, cohesively, where it truly sounds like everybody was on the same page and there was a theme. Right. Whereas in previous albums, you've got a weird music with poetry over it. Like, you know, Soft Parade was one of their worst albums and panned by critics because it was their most artistic of all the albums. There was a lot more poetry on it. It wasn't as rock and roll as the first album or Morrison Hotel. You know, it was kind of, but actually the funny part is Morrison Hotel shows where they were moving to, because there were more bluesy songs like Maggie McGill. Even Peace Frogs got more of a bluesy feel to it. So you could see that that's where they were going.
But they weren't there yet. Yeah.
But they hadn't gotten to it. Yeah. And, you know, there was neat little things about it, like the fact that Jim Morrison sang in the bathroom of the studio because it gave a good reverb, a natural reverberation in the room for the echo. The fact that they brought in an actual bass player to record the tracks.
Not just Manzarek going
to not just Ray Manzarek, you know, bubbling around on his little gimmick. So it's still to this day one of my favorite albums, and definitely my favorite Doors album.
And really the Doors, you know, they're the reason there's an Elektra Records. You know, they were the big thing on Elektra Records. They were like the shoot off of, I think they were shoot off of Warner Brothers. And they had a big stake in the Doors, and the Doors kind of carried that label for many, many years. And really it's kind of funny, you know, Elektra, I think they had Queen at one point. I remember having a Queen album, my greatest hits, like in the 80s. But then in the 80s, they really got they got really taken over by Motley Crue. Motley Crue was the next one to carry the torch and just really take Elektra. And I think Megaforce.
The Cure was on Elektra too at one point.
Yeah, and then then Megaforce Records, I think, was a subsidiary of Elektra, and that's where you got like some of the first Metallica shit going on. And then Metallica was on Elektra forever, and then that became, you know, whatever it is now. But I think Metallica is their own thing now.
I mean, it's also like you mentioned, like where they would have gone from there. And in all honesty, like they did try to go on. You know, after this, there's surprisingly 2 other albums that the Doors released, but nobody really knows about them. One was called Full Circle, and the other one was, I believe it was called Other Voices. That's the one. And they actually had Ray Manzarek singing songs and Robbie, and it's just terrible. It is, it's terrible because you lost the most dynamic member of the band. Right. You know, because you put anybody else in that band, it's not as interesting.
So you don't think Krieger and Manzarek make it without Morrison? You don't think there's a
no? I mean, I'll put it to you like this: you go back, and in the mid '90s, they tried to do another tour as the Doors with Ian Astbury from the Cult as the lead singer, and Ian Astbury, I couldn't think of anybody better to play the Jim Morrison role than Ian Astbury. And it still was like, okay, I mean, it's cool. The guy from the Cult is playing with the Doors, but it was nothing on the level that made
there was a weird thing with that too. Yeah, there was a weird thing with that too, because there was a lot of bad press going around on that because there was like the Morrison estate was fighting with the Doors, and the way that they were calling it, it was, you know, the Doors, you know, they had to change the name of it. You know, it's like an evening of the music of the Doors or something like that. They couldn't say it was the Doors with Ian Astbury, or, you know, they however they, and it was this big legal thing, and it kind of like never, I remember it was like an MTV thing for like MTV News when they used to have that 10 till the hour.
Oh yeah. Kurt Loder, baby.
The kids will never know. Tabitha Soren. Getting in there.
Tabitha Soren. Oh my God. Don't
Yeah.
even get me started.
Hey, I was even there for Sway. Remember
there
Sway
you
at
go.
the
I
end? Yeah.
do remember Sway. He was good.
Yeah.
So one of the ones that I want to touch on, because I want to make sure that this gets out there before we run out of time. One of the biggest albums of all time, let alone of 1971, the top of the rock and roll food chain in 1971 was Led Zeppelin.
Sure.
And they put out their quintessential album of number 4, or Four Symbols, or Zoso, or whatever you want to call it. The fourth Led Zeppelin album came out,
the Stairway to Heaven album,
the biggest album, quite possibly of all time in rock and roll. It was a monster. And I mean, we don't need to go too deep, but let's just say that every single song on this album still gets played on rock radio today. Yeah. Classic rock radio plays the entirety of this album in regular rotation, for good or bad.
Right. No, I mean, it's everything you want from Led Zeppelin. It's the distilled concentrate version of Led Zeppelin.
Absolutely.
You show, if you meet someone who not aware of Led Zeppelin, this is what you play for them. You don't play them the other ones. You go get 4, come back to me, and then we'll go backwards or we'll go forwards or whatever. But this is where you need to start, because this is going to hook you in. And I mean, it
definitely still got some of that raw energy that you got on the first 2 albums, with with songs like Rock and Roll and Black Dog, 4 Sticks, Misty Mountain Hop. They still have that
Levee Breaks.
Well, not so much with Misty Mountain Hop, but they still have, like, Rock and Roll and Black Dog still definitely have that edge that you got with Whole Lotta Love or Good Times, Bad Times.
They made a conscious effort to be a little more, I mean, there are slow songs on this album, don't get me wrong, but
absolutely.
But it seems like Black Dog, Rock and Roll, When the Levee Breaks, even Misty Mountain Hop, there's a tempo to this album. And also it's, this is the beauty of albums from this era, and even in the 70s, that everything is like 30 minutes tops, so it's 8 fucking songs. And even though some of them are 8 minutes long, it doesn't fucking matter, because every song's a fucking killer. Yeah. And then when we got into not so much of the 80s, because there was still a lot of, it was pretty lean in the 80s too. They still operated off of the 60s, 70s, paradigm that but they never, but once you get to the 90s and CDs, and we can go longer because the 70-minute length of a CD, 75 minutes, I think, that's when you started to get a lot of filler. Even on great albums, it was like, okay, well, these ones at the end, I don't know, but not everybody could do it. But it seemed like when you had a band like a Led Zeppelin or an Aerosmith or a Stones or whatever, someone of the classics, the top of the top, when they were putting out albums that were super popular, the best of their career, every song was top to bottom, like you said. Even with the Doors, it was top to bottom, but it was no more than 30 minutes,
right? or 45 tops. But it's one of those things where this was the ultimate natural progression for this band, because when you get to like Led Zeppelin 3, it starts off with Immigrant Song, which is a juggernaut. Right. It's literally what you expect it to sound like when Vikings attack a city, or if Thor is gonna attack an evil army.
I think you're letting some of popular culture taint your memories or your perceptions of that song, but I'll allow it. But
at the same time, comparative to almost everything else on that album, that was pretty much the acoustic folky album, was Led Zeppelin 3. And they took the best of Led Zeppelin 3, mixed it with the best of Led Zeppelin 2, and you end up with one of the greatest albums of all time, which also, no matter how sick to death we may be of hearing Stairway to Heaven, it is still one of the greatest songs ever written, because it runs a dynamic from starting off as a folk tune into a classic arena rock song that just explodes. And so, I mean, you see that this was the natural progression.
It laid the groundwork for every rock band after that, because every rock band wanted to have their Stairway to Heaven. Now, maybe they wouldn't go 7 or 8 minutes long with it, but they all wanted to have
2 seconds.
Yeah, they would, they would try to do their 4-minute, even 5-minute version. You always knew like that ballad song was coming on whatever, even on like a LA Guns or some bullshit like that. You were going to get that ballad of Jane, and that was going to be their one. It's going to be the lighter in the air, and then maybe fist pumping at the end. That's kind of what the template was for these bands that came after Led Zeppelin, that were obviously influenced, whether sonically or musically or lyrically or whatever. Def Leppard, they all had these songs where they start off soft and then they kick in, and this
right.
and this is the one that started really all of that. You even look like in Southern rock, you have Freebird. Freebird is the Southern rock, Stairway to Heaven.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny that you said it that way, because it really was almost like a blueprint.
Yeah.
Here's your blueprint. So
a couple rockers. Then you get one that, is the slow build, possibly. Yeah. And then they started to figure out, hey, when we do the slow one, we won't make it so ethereal and mystical. We'll get a little lovey in there. We'll tell a little love story or something like that. Yeah, that's what we'll do, and that will get the ladies. And people figure it kind of mutated into something different later on. But that's kind of, like I said, the initial idea and framework was placed with these albums, because in the 80s it was so fucking just it was almost a joke of how these bands would come out. Here's the fast song, the rockin' song that everybody loves, and then here's the ballad,
right.
That's single number 2, and then single number 3 is somewhere between the rockin' one and the slow one. It's exactly what they do. But Zeppelin, with this, they had all their bases covered, and I really don't know, because I guess obviously I wasn't alive, or I guess I was alive. I was just born, but I don't remember was Black Dog or Rock and Roll like the first single from this album? Was Stairway to Heaven even a single, or was that just something that got people gravitated to on FM radio? So I don't know.
Honestly, I think that Rock and Roll and Misty Mountain Hop were the singles off the album. I'm not even sure that Black Dog was necessarily a single. But Stairway to Heaven, I think, got released as a single later, because it did get played on FM stations.
It was kind of more of a grassroots.
Again, it was the bathroom track. 8 minutes, bam, I can go have a sandwich and go take a leak and have a cup of coffee. But the other thing is that this is also the time when some of the proggy, or what would go on to become prog rock bands, came into play.
Well, if you really listen to the end of Stairway to Heaven, it gets it takes those turns, and it goes down some pretty instrumental and musical hallways and byways. There's that late, I'm not saying it's Yes, and I know that's one of the bands that actually had 2 albums that came out in 71, but and even Pink Floyd, those, I'm not saying it didn't have those elements, but it wasn't focused on them necessarily. I think Led Zeppelin is probably more a straight up blues rock and roll band, but yeah, I think in the Zeppelin DNA is some of that, but there were other bands at that time that were focusing more on that exclusively.
Well, and it's really kind of cool, and I'm glad that you mentioned Pink Floyd, because this is one of the ones that I wanted to talk about the most, because it is this is probably my favorite of the Pink Floyd albums. Just because the first half of this album is unbelievable. And it's kind of funny because you mentioned that, you only had about 6 or 8 songs. Well, this is one of the albums that the entire B side of the album is one song in Echoes. And it was that thing where you listen to the beginning of the album and it's kind of a rock and roll album in the sense that Fearless is a rock and roll song, even though it's played on an acoustic guitar for the most part. One of These Days is a straight up rocker. It's a heavy tune. It does have that prog taste to it, but it's a straight up rock and roll song for an instrumental. But Echoes is the quintessential prog rock extravaganza. 23 minutes of Roger Waters' brain just melting into a bass guitar. It's neat and insane and awesome all at the same time. And then the follow-up to this is their biggest album of all time, and one of the few albums that stayed on the Billboard top 200 for the better part of 30 years.
Right. It just recently fell off. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, but then, Pink Floyd, I don't know until you got to Dark Side. I mean, they were popular, but it was
they were still very underground at that
underground.
Point.
Yeah.
They hadn't become the hit makers. They weren't Pink Floyd to everyone the way that they are now.
No,
they were still
at least in this country. And if you watch some Pink Floyd documentaries, you see like how they were perceived and how they kind of tried to take a little bit from every style that was going around to them and kind of distill it and mix it up and make their own thing. And until you get to Dark Side, that's really the one that's like, boom, here it is. It's
well.
And I think this is probably, you wouldn't have got to Dark Side without this one,
Absolutely. I agree. And, you mentioned Yes having two albums. And I believe the first of the two albums was the Yes album, which much like Pink Floyd's Metal, it only has 6 songs on it.
Sure.
And they're all, the first 3 songs total out to about 20 minutes. That's one half of the record right there, because you got a 9-minute and 42-second song and a 9.5-minute song. But the thing is, there's only one hit on it. And even then, I can't imagine it having been the single, but I've Seen All Good People. That's the big track on that album. And then you get to The Fragile, which was released about 8 months later, and you have Roundabout. There's only one hit on either of these two albums. And they were the quintessential prog, they are one of the quintessential prog rock bands, in terms of just kind of doing what they did and not giving a shit whether or not it was going to land on radio.
I think Long Distance Runaround was somewhat of a hit, and it's actually one of the shorter songs on Fragile. But Yes, they were definitely the people that loved Yes. They're a specific lane that those people traveled in, and now I guess you would say it's the Fish lane, or it's the and that's probably a little too avant-garde even for this. These guys were, I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily a good comparison or not, but
no, I see, because Fish I put more into the Grateful Dead, jam
exactly.
band kind of thing.
But I'm trying to say, like, even to relate, because I'm trying to relate it to something that people could maybe even put it, but that would probably be the closest thing today. I don't know what else Fragile, like a Yes album would equate to in 2021, but I mean they definitely these guys obviously laid the groundwork for a Rush to come along. Without Yes, you wouldn't have Rush. You wouldn't have some of those in that lane, and even going heavier, going like a Dream Theater or those kinds of things. I mean, Yes. And at the time too, 71, we're kind of at the turn of the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. It's very psychedelic and blah blah blah. So people, while you could say there's not a lot of hits or whatever, they didn't need to be. Those are what the songs that drew people in. and then a lot of those people stayed.
Oh, absolutely.
And
I mean, like I didn't realize that I kind of forgot about it, but Cry of Love by Hendrix, they actually put out a posthumous album in 71 with Hendrix. So he did make the cut, but it was the stuff that he had started recording with the Band of Gypsies lineup. So it's a lot more blues based. It's got the Easy Rider, it's got Drifting, it's got Freedom, and one of my favorite Hendrix songs, which is Angel. I love that song. But it was definitely more blues based than psychedelic like the previous stuff. Whereas Yes, you can see with Yes, they were still they were at that tail end of the psychedelic stuff. And that's where the prog really comes from, is doing more of the straight up rock and roll, but on that psychedelic side where you expand it, you make it a little bit more avant-garde. So, and another one that was part of that process was Jethro Tull. But on the
flute side, on the flute version, on the flute side.
Well, they were that. I mean, they were that psychedelic yet folky kind of proggy band. And Aqualung, I don't know anybody who even remotely likes Jethro Tull that doesn't like Aqualung. Right. It's got two of their biggest hits, and this is Cross-Eyed Mary and the title track Aqualung. But it's also got songs, like Wandering Aloud is a great song. Locomotive Breath is that's a pretty heavy duty song.
Who covered it? Didn't Metallica cover that one, or somebody covered? Yeah, I think somebody covered it.
I want to say Wasp covered Locomotive Breath. Funny enough, one of my all-time favorite covers is Clutch doing a cover of Cross-Eyed Mary. It's phenomenal. Like
Pearl Jam did one too. Yeah, I remember that was very popular.
Really, Pearl Jam did I don't know that it must be a deep cut that came out on something weird that I don't have. Yeah, because I've got almost everything from Pearl Jam, sorry, and I don't remember it.
No, sorry, I don't know why I mixed up because these bands. It was Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden did a cover of Cross-Eyed Mary. It was a B-side.
I'm sure. And now it's making me want to open up the iTunes. I closed out the PC version of Zoom just so that I could open up other things and make it work without it crashing. But I mean, this album, I remember buying this cassette, and I think I still have it. But I bought this cassette because it was the one that I knew, and and I was surprisingly very pleased with it, and it's still I still love it to this day. So when it comes down to Jethro Tull, this is the Jethro Tull album that if I was told I could only have one, I need to have this one. Right. But now you're making me look. Yeah. So I do have the Cross-Eyed Mary. You're right. Iron Maiden did do a cover of Cross-Eyed Mary on the Best of the B-Sides. Yeah. And I'm gonna look because now I'm trying to find the who did the Locomotive Breath. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was having a brain fart there.
Well, here, let's while you're looking that up, let's I'm gonna switch it up here. So also at this point too, you're getting into some of the big ones from, I guess, what would eventually become adult contemporary listing artists. But they were still kind of in that singer-songwriter phase. Rod Stewart, Every Picture Tells a Story. I mean, talk about not just classic rock, but classic hits radio. Still playing Every Picture Tells a Story, the title track. They're still playing Maggie May, Mandolin Wind. Those were big songs for him. Again, another 8-song album. But he was very acoustic at this point still. It was very, and Rod, is, the voice, it's a unique voice, a Rod Stewart song. he's the palatable Tom Waits. You know, he did Tom Waits songs. It was a Downtown Train. Years later, that was a Tom Waits song. But yeah, I mean, this is where, you know, you're really starting to, you know, rack up the hits. He's really putting in the work, and, you know, really racking up his catalog at this point. Even like if you just think in a greatest hits sense, you know, the 3 of the 8 songs are, you know, monster songs. And then I also got an album this year from Elton John too.
Well,
And, yeah,
before we get to the Elton John,
yeah.
what I noticed that was kind of funny is, not only did Rod Stewart have his, I believe that was his debut solo album, Every Picture, right?
Right. Let's see.
Oh no, I'm sorry. It's the third. It's his third studio album. But the funny thing is that he also put out an album with the Faces that same year. And it's, you know, that's the one that's got Stay With Me on it. It's a Not as good as a wink to a blind horse, which I love the title of the album. I just think it's just a great album.
Rod Stewart must have been a fun hang. I think he was probably awesome to be around.
And if
just in general,
the thing that I'm trying to figure out is I'm trying to see who else was in the Faces at that time, because I mean, because it says Ronnie Lane and Ian McClagan for songwriting credit. But oh, there we go, personnel. Okay, by this point, I think, let's see if Wikipedia will open for me. I think that by this point, Ron Wood was gone and he was with the Stones. So it's just kind of interesting that Rod Stewart put out both. It was both his third solo album and the third Faces album.
He was really multitasking back then. Yeah, I mean, I mean, well, I mean, like I said, the songs, there were only 8 songs an album, so it's not like you're doing 15 tracks, you know, of something, you know, and then you got to do your own stuff, or you got to do whatever. So the amount of product that was out there, it was like very concentrated at the time. You were only getting the best that these bands or even these artists could do. You know, I think of Genesis and Phil Collins. You know, they were putting out great, and the Phil Collins and Genesis thing, especially at the beginning of the 80s, was 2 very different things. The Phil Collins thing was very poppy, but the Genesis still had kind of this proggy sheen to it, although it had a pop element as well.
Well, so, and it's funny that you refer to the solo albums of Phil Collins as poppy, when lyrically there's some of his darkest songs, because especially that first one, because it was after his first divorce. Right. And so like there was a lot of bitter, angry stuff on that, but it also had some of the biggest pop hits he ever made. Right. And funny that you mentioned Genesis, because in 1971 it was still the prog stuff that they were doing with
Peter Gabriel.
With Peter Gabriel. But I think Nursery Crime, it's the first one to feature Phil Collins as the lead singer. And it may have been the last one with Steve Hackett playing guitar
before we get Mike Rutherford.
Before Mike Rutherford takes over. And if you listen to those first couple of, like, from Then There Were Three on, where it's no longer got Steve Hackett, there's not a lot of guitar on those. Right. It's still very bassy and keyboardy and drums. And funny enough, like they're out on tour right now. Yeah. And I saw a video from the Syracuse show, and Phil's playing while sitting in a wheelchair, which is heartbreaking, but he still sounds great.
He sounded good. Yeah. Is he in a wheelchair necessarily, or is he? I saw one where he was sitting down. It just seemed to be a chair, but
I don't know. The chair that I saw. I mean, granted, I'm whoever's video I was looking at was a distance away, but it did look like it was a wheelchair. I may have been mistaken, but it looked like it.
Well, hey, like I said, as long as it sounds good. I mean, they can. A lot of people, we like I said, we tend to criticize a lot of people on this thing sometimes. Sorry, Vince Neil, but we, as long as it sounds good, I guess that's really all you can. And it's not like Phil Collins. While he was a great showman, it's not like, I don't know. I guess listening to Phil Collins music or Genesis music and him sitting down, that wouldn't bother me.
No, and honestly, in all honesty, with Genesis at this point, I wouldn't need to see. I wouldn't expect a lot of high energy stuff on stage.
Right,
they're in their 70s at this point. I just want to hear the music sound as close to what it was when they recorded it as possible. Sure. So, right. and I'm sitting here getting like, I just opened up like 6 tabs of stuff that I'm like, I want to get to these, but I don't think we're going to be able to get it all in one shot.
No, I don't think so. We're going to have to split this up, but let's kind of put a bow, at least on this little part here. The Elton John releases Madman Across the Water, Tiny Dancer, Leave On. I mean, Goodbye. So again, maybe, like I said, we're not listening to every one of these songs still anymore, but Elton John was one of those guys that when you bought an album, you listened to the whole thing, because there was a lot of greatness between him and Bertie Taupin, and this is, prime time for that. That's right in that, sweet spot, that wheelhouse of him doing stuff. And let's, before we talked about Yes having 2 albums. Alice Cooper had 2 albums in 71 too. Love It to Death, which had I'm 18 on it. So that was the big one on that one. And then he also had Killers in 71 too. So yes. Killer. Under My Wheels. So yeah, but that also had
Dead Babies.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. So very prolific time for people of all genres. There's like I said, I think we want to get into some of this other stuff too. I think we could touch on a little bit of that if we decide to do this going forward. We'll do 7. We got to do 71. I guess we'll have to do it one more time before.
We're definitely going to have to, because we've got 3 albums posthumous of the Beatles, one from George Harrison, one from John Lennon, one from Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney. We haven't even hit Black Sabbath yet.
Right.
We've got Marvin Gaye, we've got Funkadelic put out an album that year. So we've got a lot of stuff that we are going to need to do in a second part. And I mean, and some stuff that, in all honesty, Beth would really probably love to chime in on.
Well, here, let's put the list so we don't have to talk about it later. We'll put it in the prog category: Emerson, Lake, and Powell.
Palmer.
Palmer, sorry.
Palmer got replaced.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I remember them, because they actually had a hit in the 90s, or it should be in the 80s. So I remember that as Emerson, Lake, and Powell. But yeah, don't recognize any of these songs. So good luck. Yeah. But
well, let's see here. I'm gonna bring it up real quick because you didn't bring it up. But I want to see, because Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, for me, there's only one song. There's 2 songs, and neither one are on here.
Right. So there you go. But they did do something this year. This was their 2nd studio album.
Okay, because for me, Lucky Man is the one from ELP. And didn't they do the Welcome All My Friends to the Show that never ends?
That song.
Which when I was younger,
see the show. Yeah,
I thought it was the Who. It just had that. It sounded like it reminded me of something else by the Who, and I just was like, that sounds like the Who, but it wasn't. Right. And it was another time where I'm very thankful for guys like Roger McHugh and Dave Forcina, when 10 or 12-year-old Mikey was calling up the radio station, and they're going, no, that's not the Who. That's Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. Oh, thank you. Okay. And so that's where I got so much of my education.
Yeah. Another one in that vein too, like I said, so we don't have to touch on it next time. Traffic, little Steve Winwood action.
Yeah.
The Low Spark of High Heeled Boys.
And I mean, Traffic for me they are definitely a greatest hits album band for me.
Sure.
Where I want to hear some of the hits. You know, I love Dear Mr. Fantasy and stuff like that, but I didn't get into, like, Steve Winwood is always a secondary rock star in my world. Like, I love what he did with Blind Faith. You know, that was a great album. And I love some of the Spencer Davis stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and his stuff in the 80s was, was fun. But it's not, Traffic wasn't necessarily a band that I was going to go out of my way for.
Yeah, but they were, I think that, you know, people always reference them. And I think we definitely needed to at least mention them here because
absolutely.
They seem to be, when people start talking about more of the progressive stuff, or even like kind of the I don't know say bluesy, jazzy side of rock, that they're always instrumental stuff, you know, along with some singing, you know, where there was a lot of stuff in between the notes. That Traffic is always mentioned, and Steve Winwood is always mentioned for his voice and his vocal talent. So,
I mean, he's amazing, and you know, I've broached the subject many times before. Whenever we talk about, you know, how the four people that are in a band, it worked because it was the four most perfect people at that time. Like, it was meant to be that way because the original lineup of Led Zeppelin. Could you imagine Led Zeppelin 4 with Steve Winwood singing for him?
Right.
Because I couldn't. No. And that was the thing, was that you know,
it was never going to get that weird with Steve Winwood in the band, you know.
No, and it was one of those things where, like, the original lineup that Jimmy Page was trying to nail down was Steve Winwood on keyboards and vocals, John Entwistle on bass, and Keith Moon on drums. And I don't think that it would have lasted more than 1 or 2 albums. I really don't think that lineup could have made 9 records and become what Led Zeppelin did. I don't think it could have. You needed John Bonham. You needed John Paul Jones.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's weird because, you know, obviously there's you know, these little talent groups that kind of bump into each other. There was the same thing in LA in the early you know, metal stages, you know, all that kind of stuff. Everybody's kind of bopping around and it turns into different things. You know, Guns N' Roses could have been a totally different thing. Motley Crue could have been a totally different thing.
Oh yeah.
All these bands, if, you know, somebody doesn't get sick or take, you know, OD or, you know, whatever, you know, even the Seattle thing too, you know, with Mother Love Bone, you know, does that, you know, the whole Andy thing, does that make things different if he's still alive, stays alive, or gets help, or, you know, who knows? But or would it eventually all happen the same way?
it's one of those things where, I mean, whether we still love them or not today, without Pearl Jam, does that scene hit the way that it does?
Right.
Does it hit that same way with Mother Love Bone that it did with Pearl Jam?
Right.
I don't know that it necessarily would have. And you're talking to somebody that, if I could have had Mother Love Bone instead of Pearl Jam, I absolutely would have.
Right.
I would have much preferred to continue on with Andrew Wood than with Eddie Vedder. That's just my personal preference. You know, Andy Wood makes me feel good. Andy Wood gives me that emotional feeling that the likes of Hendricks, you know, where I'm in a bad mood, I put on Mother Love Bone and my day completely takes a turn. You know, sometimes that's all it needs. It's just a little Andy Wood, but it's an interesting dynamic. And to see some of the things that grow out of, you know, I'm sure that there's a few bands in the 71 era that wouldn't have existed if the previous bands hadn't ended, you know, or that they hadn't collaborated with somebody else. You know, like I said, we got 3 Beatles albums out of 3 separate Beatles that were nothing like what we would have gotten had they stayed together. And it's funny because going back, I know I'm not getting paid for it, so don't think that I'm on the dime, man. But that Beatles documentary, you hear them working through the last 2 albums, but also songs that would go on to be on their individual records later on, especially with John Lennon. You know, John Lennon already had a good chunk, and probably even more so with George Harrison, because part of the thing of why George Harrison was like getting up and left was he was just like, fuck it, I can just go and do my thing and be me without having Paul changing it, without having, because that was a big thing, was by that point, Paul McCartney was kind of the boss of the band. Even Lennon didn't have the same input that he had previously had. Right. So, but it's because Paul was still making Beatles records. John wasn't. George wasn't. Right. And Ringo was just happy to be in the room, at that point. And I don't mean to sound disparaging, but you see him working out the beginning of Octopus's Garden with George, which would end up on Abbey Road. And that's the thing, is that a lot of the songs that you see being worked through became Abbey Road, and what didn't end up on Abbey Road became Let It Be later on.
Right.
So it's pretty interesting.
It was a fertile time for them songwriting wise. And, but even though there was so much drama, which from what I understand, the documentary gets into, there was still quite a bit of innovation going on and production going on from the band themselves.
Well, and it just shows that planned doesn't always work out as good as, well, fuck it, everything else went to shit, so let's just do this, because we would never have gotten that rooftop performance if the plan that they had started with had actually gone into play. Right. Because they were supposed to do basically a TV show, and it ended up becoming them just putting a film crew that did the documentary on the roof and playing in the winter. It was it was February.
How did obviously, so you said it's the same crew. How did this, footage not come to light sooner, or someone didn't go into doing this sooner? That's, because obviously it was there, right?
Well, when you watch it, you'll see why, because it's 60 hours of footage of them just being in a room. And I guess Ringo was cast in a movie that was about to go into production at the end of the month, but they had that whole month to be able to start building around that studio. So they were going to use that studio, that soundstage in England, as the backdrop for the TV show. Oh, and it just didn't work. They didn't like it. They felt it just didn't feel like them working. So they ended up going into the finally finished Apple studio, and they just went into the studio and just started jamming out. And that was it. And even then, it took a while. You will never understand until you watch it. You will never truly appreciate what a big part of the recording process that Billy Preston truly played.
Right.
Because Billy Preston just happened to show up in the studio and say, "Hey guys, how you doing? I'm around for this, blah, 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 blah." And they said, "Well, hey, you want to sit down and jam?" Because they were trying to work out all these pieces that had piano, and they kept going, "We're going to lose the bass, or we're going to lose a guitar." Because in order for them to do it, Paul was going to have to play the piano, or John was going to have to jump on the piano, which meant that you lost one of the instruments. But Billy Preston just showing up. At one point, John Lennon even says, "Why don't we just ask him to join the band? Like, why don't we love the guy? He's an amazing musician." And you just see, all of a sudden, John's just playing a chord, and Billy just jumps on and just starts going to town. And they were like, "Holy shit." Yeah. Like, Billy Preston truly could have been the fifth Beatle, and he saved those two albums. Like, I don't know that we necessarily would have gotten Abbey Road or Let It Be without Billy Preston showing up and joining the band to record. I really don't. And that's why it made his induction into the Hall of Fame that just happened that much more special, with Ringo inducting him, and the things that he said make way more sense after watching that documentary.
Got it. Yeah.
Oh,
and so since we're going to wrap this up, I just want to put a little bow on this. It was Crazy Mary by Pearl Jam was a Victoria Williams song. That's where I got.
Gotcha. Crazy Mary, I know.
Yeah.
Crazy Mary, I know.
But yeah. Anyways, all right. So there's going to be a happy hour tomorrow I will be having a happy hour elsewhere, so I won't be joining you and Beth, but you guys will carry on without me. So drink up.
All right. I'll make sure that we make it fun and happy.
All right.
So hopefully we'll have a special third guest. Who knows? It could be, it could be Fibber McGee for all we know. He may be on the show tomorrow, but
love that
we
guy.
may see a familiar face. Yeah, I don't mind Fibber McGee too much. He's getting better at this, and he's actually excited about. I can join on, Dad. If you need me to jump on, I'm always willing. So that could be fun. But Beth will be back with us tomorrow. Dino unfortunately won't be.
Yeah.
He'll be working
Me
at
and Rialto
Curves.
Ross have got something to do.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Dino will be working his shift at Curves.
Yeah, whereas me and Rialto Ross, me and Beth share Rialto Ross. Yeah, that's kind of how we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, then. So we all know what you're saying. How could you miss us if we never go away? Bye-bye.